Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Grayzone. It's another week, and I'm here with Aaron Mate. Needs no introduction. Aaron, what's going on?
What's up, Max?
What's on your radar, Aaron?
Welcome back from your trip, and we're going to talk a bit today about what happened to you on your way back. And thanks for everyone for being here. Support the Grayzone, share this stream, like the stream, especially if you're watching it live. It helps us beat algorithmic suppression. And yeah, a lot to discuss.
Yeah, I was in Nicaragua, which is one of my favorite places. If I had been doing any political activities there, everyone would know about it because everything I do and what we do is public. There's no reason for anything to be hidden, but I was just basically, it was an extremely cold winter, unusually cold winter in DC. February is always a horrible month. And so we just got out of there and went kind of on a vacation. And on my way back, as most of you probably know, I passed through San Salvador and El Salvador, and then flew into Dulles International Airport. And in an incident which the Dulles brothers would have been proud of, coming into right as I came into the customs line with my family, an officer was standing there from Customs and Border Protection, and he said, "Mr. Blumenthal?" And, I knew what was next. It wasn't something that I wasn't totally prepared for, given the wave of repression and surveillance of journalists, dissident journalists, or critical journalists and activists across the West, especially in Europe, as we discussed last week with Ali Abunema. But with me, I still kind of wondered, like, what are they actually wanting to talk to me about? Like, I'm not coming from Beirut, where Hassan Nasrallah's funeral was just observed, and I knew there was going to be stops of people who had attended that as journalists, and we'll talk about that in a second. So as I was being led down a hallway by this officer, he turns to me and he said, I caught your last appearance on Judge Napolito. I guess he wasn't Italian because it's Judge Napolitano. And he leads me into a cavernous secondary screening room. Doesn't put my passport in the case that they usually do. And he says, this is just a friendly visit. You're not a target of anything, which, it just felt to me like he's trying to warm me up for something. Stands across from me at a metal table, places a questionnaire before me with basic information that, I didn't have any problem giving, but perhaps I shouldn't have participated at all. But it was 3 a.m. I was with my family. I gave my itinerary, which they already know, and my contact info, whatever. Then he flips over the sheet and there's a list of handwritten names there. And I wasn't allowed to photograph them. There were just a handful of names. The majority of them were Muslim names that were so common that it was even difficult to know if I knew any of those people. He asked me, "Do you know any of these people?" One of them was like Mohammed Khan. And then there were two other names, Nicole Smith, which, I can't think of anyone named Nicole Smith except for Anna Nicole Smith, the late model who died under suspicious circumstances at age 39, after being married to like a nonagenarian zillionaire. And then there was Susan Benjamin. I didn't know that name either. But then, the officer lets me out after I say, I don't know. He tries to ask me a few other questions, and I'm becoming less participatory. So he goes into a little room, comes out, and lets me go. Still don't know what it's about. Clearly, it's not about me being in Nicaragua. Like, they didn't seem to be that interested in that. And he lets me out. And then Anya, my wife, is well known to all the Grayzone community, starts Googling the names we could remember. And Susan Benjamin comes up as Medea Benjamin. I didn't know that was her birth name. we knew Medea wasn't a Karen, but we didn't know she was a Susan. So that to me is disturbing. I spoke to Medea the following day, which was like 72 hours ago, and she told me that she had been harassed for a long period by the feds. Every time she returned from the country, they'd try to subject her to questioning. The FBI was calling her, asking for an interview. And then she started filing a series of complaints and they stopped. But based on my experience, she wonders if the harassment will begin again. I can only speculate on what led to me being flagged. I don't know if this is a new initiative of the Trump administration and Kash Patel, who Aaron has interviewed twice at the Grayzone, or I was flagged from something prior. I mean, this was my first international trip since my humanitarian intervention on Tony Blinken at his last press briefing. But I don't know if it relates to that. I don't know what it was about. And that's part of the kind of harassment where, you just don't know why the black hand of the federal government is hovering over you. Some likened it to like a tap on the shoulder, and others find it more severe. But clearly, it pales in comparison to what Richard Medhurst, Ali Abunimah, Eve Engler, and Kit Clarenberg and others have gone through. And that's partly because we're in the United States, where we have a First Amendment, we have free speech protection. But the attention should remain focused on those other cases, especially Richard Medhurst, who has had to, he's being accused by Austria of literally being a Hamas member for his journalism. So I just thought it was important to document what happened with me and to kind of inform the public about it.
Yeah. And the fact that Medea Benjamin is worthy of that much scrutiny, that people would be asked about her. I mean, that speaks to I think, just the influence that Code Pink has had in, I mean, what are they really best known for? They confront politicians. They go into their hearings and they call them out, especially for the Gaza genocide. Code Pink's been at the forefront of that. And that is a bipartisan policy. So it wouldn't surprise me at all that sort of a crackdown on that would continue under Trump. Trump recently launched a so-called anti-Semitism task force. And what's that going to be? Just a front for the government to go after people who speak out against the Gaza genocide and to even deport them.
Yeah.
If they're foreign students and the like.
Yeah. And we just learned that Trump has appointed as deputy director of the FBI, Dan Bongino. I don't know if this was a Bongino job, but I do remember back in, when was it? October 13th, 2023. So just a few days after October 7th, Dan Bongino, this is the new deputy director of the FBI. He freaked out and had a meltdown because Hamas announced a day of rage, calling for protests in Jerusalem, thousands of miles away. And Bongino, who has a McMansion in Sanford, Florida, on the beach, freaked out and said, "F the savages. I'm living my life tomorrow. I'll be cautious. And yes, I'm concerned. I addressed it all today, but F the savages. If they're going to have their day of rage or whatever they call it, then I'm going to have my day of go F yourself." So Royal Tough Guy was worried that Hamas was going to invade America and come to Florida and, stage an Al-Aqsa flood invasion of the shores of Florida. And he went ballistic when I mocked him for it on his program. But these are the kind of characters that are now in the FBI. So I mean, they're like fanatically pro-Israel, paranoid about Palestine solidarity activism, can't seem to distinguish between activism and Hamas militancy. And again, I don't know if this was a Trump flag or something else, but there's the temperature is definitely rising, and the Trump administration is not going to turn it down on Palestine solidarity activism. I mean, we saw students at Barnard University, they're completely masked. They're covering their identity completely because several of them have been expelled from school for their activism. What we're seeing in Europe is far more severe. And David Miller, our colleague who is in the UK, was detained by 8 counterterror cops, I think just yesterday, returning from the Hassan Nasrallah funeral, which he was covering. Which, I mean, at least he knows what this is about. This is it's clearly repression. He was there as a journalist, not there to like provide material support to a proscribed organization. And he described how he was treated. Monday, February 24th, he got off a plane from Istanbul to Heathrow. In front of him were a wide circle of people waiting for someone. He knew it was him. One of them, SO-15, former Special Branch plainclothes officer of the Counterterror Command, asked for his passport and whether he started his journey in Istanbul. Of course, he knew that they knew that was not the case. In any case, I had done nothing wrong. As I said to them, visiting Beirut to cover the funeral of Syed Hassan Nasrallah. That was his first taste of Schedule 7. They started to explain what Schedule 7 was, and I said, yes, I know about it. I'm a researcher who studies terrorism legislation. And he realized that the circle of people had been waiting for him. There were 8 officers to detain him. And others have been detained as well, coming back to the US and subjected to interrogations from that event, which was buzzed by 3 Israeli F-16 jets. There was a flyover and an attempt to intimidate them. And apparently Israel Katz, the Israeli defense minister, considered bombing the funeral, which would have killed possibly tens of thousands of unarmed people simply because of their politics and ideology. So again, what's happening overseas is far more severe. It's still within the realm of Five Eyes.
I wanted to say a few words about Dan Bongino, who you mentioned earlier, the new deputy director of the FBI. Prior to October 7th, 2023, I knew of Dan Bongino as, obviously a Trump guy, a right-wing pundit, but who did really good work on Russiagate. And in fact, on his podcast, he would often cite the work that I did on Russiagate. And he wrote a book about it that I thought was really good. That's what I mainly knew him as. But then after October 7th, I saw someone like repeating what I just thought was unhinged propaganda. And like you showed that example before, this is another one where he went after Rashida Tlaib, the only Palestinian American member of Congress, and accused her of trying to start a religious war in the U.S. And this is the new deputy director of the FBI, accusing a member of Congress of trying to ignite a religious war, repeats terrorist propaganda, who's an enemy of the U.S. And what I tried to point out in response to this was that, like, to me, this allegation that people who criticize Israel, who criticize mass murder, are enemies of the U.S. and traitors, it's very similar to what was used during Russiagate, when people in the Trump camp, people who were skeptical of the national security state, they were accused of being Kremlin sympathizers. And I try to make the point that it's actually a similar playbook, which, in our brief exchange, like we got into a brief exchange on Twitter, he did not really appreciate. But I think it's unfortunate that people in the Trump camp can't see the connection between the sort of neo-McCarthyism that was directed against them and a similar playbook being used against people who oppose genocide, who are critical of the Israeli government. And even if Trump supporters don't agree with the word genocide, the fact is, just because you're critical of a foreign government doesn't necessarily make you someone trying to start a religious war, as he accused Rashida Tlaib. And what I said was that was also Islamophobic, which he didn't appreciate. But it's just interesting to me that people can see the cynicism of Russiagate, but they can't see a similar playbook involved in demonizing critics of Israel. And unfortunately, the new deputy director of the FBI has fallen for that. And I won't be surprised. Like, on the one hand, I welcome people who want to bring sunlight to Russiagate, to the FBI. That was a massive scandal with huge consequences. And I do expect that with people like that at the FBI, we'll be learning some important disclosures about that. But at the same time, I'm concerned that they're going to weaponize their agency now to go after people who support Palestine, just as the Biden administration did too. So that policy is bipartisan, but it's just that's unfortunately an aspect of MAGA. It's like they can recognize the absurdity of all this Russiagate stuff, but not similar characteristics when it comes to going after supporters of Palestinian rights.
No, it's not like they're principled critics of the new Cold War. It's like the Democrats during the Bush era on the Iraq War. There was a partisan imperative for defending Trump against the Russiagate hoax because he was the target and Dan Bongino was climbing through the ranks of Trump Incorporated and Conservatism Incorporated. He is a sort of astroturf figure who comes actually from corporate media. They call him a podcaster, but he is a creation of a corporate media complex that also profited heavily from Rush Limbaugh, just spreading rage and dividing people. Bongino stepped into Limbaugh's slot. It was Westwood One, this giant corporation that syndicates radio, basically pays stations to put on various shock jock personalities that divide people along partisan lines in a really extreme fashion because it's profitable. Their board is just a collection of corporate sleazebags who actually don't share the ideology of the hosts. Westwood One is owned by Cumulus Media. Just look at their board of directors. These are the people who brought us not just Dan Bongino, but Ben Shapiro. Ben Shapiro's syndicated in media across the country. And you listen to him and it's like unlistenable. He's not very charismatic. He's not that talented. He doesn't share the views of people in a lot of the deep red areas that he's being pushed. But, he pushes the program of the corporate executives, extreme free market capitalism, dividing people with social issues. And they are actually given directives not to oppose Israel. They were certainly given a directive after January 6th not to challenge the election. That was something Westwood One handed down, and Dan Bongino had some friction with them. But, it's not like there's a meritocracy in the world of right-wing radio. It's corporate radio. It's corporate media. And they weren't challenging Russiagate because they feared outbreak of world war between nuclear powers. It was to protect the head of their power mafia. So that, that's why they're being so inconsistent. And absolutely, the Trump national security state will escalate against Palestine solidarity activism. We saw the FBI go after students from George Mason University who were Palestinian Americans who were campaigning against the genocide on campus. Their homes were raided by FBI Joint Terror Task Forces with local police. So it didn't start during the Trump administration, but I'm sure it will escalate. And again, I don't know if I was flagged for that reason, but we need to be vigilant. And if you're an activist, if you're involved in any way, know your rights. The Supreme Court ruled in 1969 that police can lie to you in order to elicit a criminal confession of something you might not have even done. They are talking to you in order to get you talking, to see if they can entrap or manipulate you or turn you. And the ACLU has said again and again that if you're at an airport, the Customs and Border Protection does not have a right to prevent you from entering the country unless you are accused of a crime and they have a warrant. So you have the right to remain silent. I think we spent too much time on that. But
well, it's important. It's important. And again, this is not just about your individual case. It's about the broader implications. But yeah, we can move on to more on Gaza-related issues. You want to talk about the latest article at the Grayzone about the Bibas family deception perpetrated by Israel and its supporters?
Well, Wyatt Reed and I did what I think is one of the more authoritative takedowns of the official propaganda. But just to kind of like set the scene, the Empire State Building was lit up in memory of 3 people who are not even US citizens, who were Israeli citizens, who were kidnapped taken hostage on October 7th, Shiri Kafir and Ariel Bibas, and who lost their lives in the Gaza Strip, who were killed in the Gaza Strip. Shining in orange tonight to honor the memories of Shiri, Ariel, and Kafir Bibas. This is the Empire State Building. I mean, did it ever light up for one of the 18,000 and more kids slaughtered in the Gaza Strip by Israel's killing machine in the last 16 months? Of course not. The Empire State Building is effectively owned by Zionist billionaire Peter Malkin. He's the chair of the Malkin Group that owns it. He's also the father-in-law of Connecticut Senator and neocon warmonger Richard Blumenthal. No relation to me. Who controls America? Who's in charge here? I mean, this isn't even for Americans. This is insane. And how were they killed? Israel says that they were killed by the bare hands of Hamas militants, which is strange. Why would you just strangle some kids for no reason, just for sheer enjoyment because you're a sadistic psychopath, when you had orders to take human collateral and you have hundreds of children in prison, in Israeli prisons, who you want to get out? You're losing collateral. Like, politically, it doesn't make sense. No one is given a reason for why that would have been done. And we'll talk about this literal spin doctor who's putting forward the forensic evidence without providing any forensic evidence, Hen Kugel, who has said that they did this. But first, I think it's important to kind of go through what we know about how they died. And their deaths were actually announced in November 2023, at a time when Israel was basically carpet bombing the Gaza Strip. This is from the Guardian in November 29th, 2023. Hamas says 10-month-old hostage Kafir Bibas was killed in Israeli bombing. And they say that Shiri and Ariel have also died. The mother. This information was kept from the Israeli public for the most part. I mean, the Israeli government avoided telling the public that they were dead because it wanted to keep them in suspense. And I don't know if, I mean, we'll probably be demonetized, but so I'll just have to go through kind of the notes. But I would have wanted to have played the video that Yarden Bibas, Shiri's husband, delivered from captivity in Gaza in I think it was early December. During the time when Israel was refusing to extend the humanitarian pause, when captives and prisoners were being exchanged between Hamas and the Israeli government. And Hamas offered the Bibas family remains to Israel, their bodies. And Yarden Bibas appears in a hostage video pleading for Israel to accept their bodies so that they can be properly buried. And I think he was even offered as well. And Israel rejected it and refused. Why? Because it wanted to keep the Jewish Israeli public and the world in suspense, so that when there was a ceasefire and they had to accept the bodies, they could then say, oh my God, they're dead. They killed them. And that would allow Israel to derail the ceasefire and possibly go back to war on Gaza, or at least point the finger at Hamas and deflect from the fact that they had slaughtered 18,000 children in Gaza.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, there was a statement by the field commander who was involved in capturing them, and no one believes, although they've generally told the truth all along, or mostly the truth. Hamas and the various factions in the Gaza Strip haven't really had the same reason to lie as the Israeli military has. These statements just never make it into Western media. But this is a field commander in the smaller and lesser known Mujahideen brigades, which had had Shiri Bibas and her two sons who were separated from their father in the chaos of October 7th. The captive Shiri Bibas worked in the office of the Southern Command leader in the Gaza division and previously served in Israeli Unit 8200. That's the cyber security unit of the Israeli army, which spies on people in Gaza and compromises them. And the Israeli government has not contradicted this information. When she was captured, we sent her children with her out of compassion for them, implying that she demanded that her children not be left alone when she was being taken hostage. The Israeli occupation killed her along with her children after bombing them along with their captors. And that's very damaging for Israel. I mean, it blunts the propaganda impact of claiming that Hamas just strangled these children and that they had to do whatever was necessary to stop these savages. So that statement has been ignored. But there's so much evidence that Israel was killing its own hostages in Gaza since October 7th. I mean, we know about the mass Hannibal directive on October 7th. The Israeli Air Force just acknowledged its own orders to carry out mass Hannibal and destroy everything that moved on Gaza. This is new. Yoav Gallant, the former Israeli defense minister, acknowledged the Hannibal directive was employed, which authorizes and orders Israeli troops to attack Jewish Israelis who have been taken captive. And he complained that it hadn't been applied comprehensively enough. But then we've got like the Israeli throughout the whole time. And this is, you can just refer to Wyatt and my article with Wyatt in the Grayzone for a much more comprehensive history of this. But throughout the entire time, the families, since December 2023, since captives started coming out of Gaza, family members and those captives themselves have openly acknowledged that their greatest fear was being killed by Israeli airstrikes. And here is propaganda poster child for the Israeli hostages, Noah Argamani, testifying on behalf of the Israeli delegation at the United Nations, acknowledging that she was attacked by her own country, by her own military while in Gaza, and that two captives she was with, Itai Svirsky and Yossi Sharabi, were killed, and she survived.
I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I thought it's going to be my last second of my life. I screamed so loud so someone would hear me. And I heard Yossi screaming too. But after a few seconds, I stopped hearing from Yossi.
She's talking about Israel bombing her. So, Aaron, I mean, you remember Shiri Bibas, the mother, her body wasn't returned properly initially. And that almost derailed the ceasefire. And what actually happened, according to Hamas, was that they mixed up the bodies because it was difficult for them to actually extract the bodies and keep track of them from under the rubble. So they had returned the body of a Palestinian who was also killed, found under the rubble with Shiri Bibas. Rubble caused by the Israeli Air Force bombing. I mean, it makes sense that they were killed by Israel. You can argue, and it's not powerful enough for Israeli propaganda, but you can plausibly argue that it's Hamas's fault for kidnapping them, taking them into Gaza, and putting them at risk. But the Israelis want us to believe that they were strangled methodically in order to light up the Empire State Building
And that's why the family, as you guys report on at the Grayzone, has written a letter to the Israeli government asking them to stop making claims about how they were killed.
Yeah.
Because the family itself has been provided no details at all from whatever forensic examinations have occurred. And what they're basically doing is telling the Israeli government to stop exploiting their deaths, just as the Israeli government and its apologists exploited the deaths of Israeli women on October 7th to claim without evidence that they were the victims of rape. And an Israeli family even had to call that out because their daughter, their sister, Gal Abdush, was being used as a poster child of sexual violence when there was actually no evidence to support that. And in fact, they said, the family said it was impossible that it happened because they spoke to her right before she was killed on October 7th. And so now we have a similar thing going on with the Bibas family.
Yep. They told Netanyahu to shut up. I mean, they're all but saying that they don't believe this.
Yeah.
But they're not saying it. They're not confirming what Yarden Bibas said explicitly in Gaza.
And I don't fault them for that because he was in captivity when that video was made. So, I mean, that's not, to me, something that I would take the word of. But the fact is, there is ample reason to believe that they were killed in an Israeli strike, including, as you talked about, this is regular Israeli practice, not just the Hannibal Directive on October 7th, but we know that they've killed dozens of Israeli captives ever since. And why wouldn't they when they're subjecting this tiny strip of land, the Gaza Strip, this dense area where people can't escape, to, massive bombing every single day without any regard for who they're killing? It makes perfect sense that Israelis would get caught up in that.
Yeah. Maya Sherman, who was the mother of Ron Sherman, an Israeli soldier, uniformed Israeli soldier, was captured on October 7th, said that her son was killed in a tunnel by Israeli soldiers who pumped diesel fumes into the tunnel in a failed attempt to kind of like fumigate it and kill Hamas militants. And she said her son was killed like in Auschwitz. And she dedicated a gravestone to him, which I think said he was killed by the Israeli military, and they went and destroyed the gravestone. 3 Israelis broke free from captivity in Gaza and were sniped to death by the Israeli military. The one that got away was hunted down by Israeli soldiers and executed at point blank range.
Because they thought because they thought they were Palestinian.
They thought they were Palestinians.
Just as that guy in Miami recently shot 2 Israelis because he thought they were Palestinian.
Yeah. And then the Israelis who were shot and survived by a Zionist American fanatic went on Facebook and claimed they were victims of an anti-Semitic attack.
And said death to the Arabs.
And said death to the Arabs.
Yeah.
It's it's an insane asylum. We're in the Jewish section of Jonestown here. It really makes you wonder, what would they do without Palestinians? They just have to start like dressing up the bad section of their society as Palestinians and playing some kind of Hunger Games. But this is what happened in Gaza. And one of the few hostages who we know for a fact was killed by Hamas, Hirsch Goldberg Pollen, because Hamas had announced a policy of killing hostages if the Israelis attempted these operations to capture them. They were trying to deter these operations because they were killing so many civilians in Gaza in the course of trying to liberate hostages. He complained in his own video from captivity that the airstrikes had nearly killed him many times. Noah Argamani, in her own hostage video, told the truth about what she retold at the UN, that an Israeli airstrike killed 2 Israelis who were with her. The point is, the Israeli authorities, many Israelis wanted to prioritize the captives. And that's why the ceasefire is holding so far, is there's so much pressure on Netanyahu from the Israeli public. So many Israelis wanted that, but the Israeli authorities and Netanyahu's fanatical coalition, the Israeli military, and a broad swath of Israeli society, I do think the majority of Jewish Israelis prioritize bloodlust over getting the hostages out. And there could have been a deal before the Bibas family was killed by what seems like an Israeli airstrike. And there was a deal on the table right there to return their bodies. But Israel wanted to exploit the propaganda impact and dupe its own citizens into believing they were alive. I mean, even Tapper did that on, the American.
And this is just standard Israeli history. Everything is constantly weaponized and lied about to justify aggression. Going back to the founding of the state, like there's an excuse for everything. Like when hundreds of thousands of Palestinians are ethnically cleansed by the early Zionists, the excuse is, oh, well, that happened because their armies attacked us, and also their armies told them all to flee so that they could attack the Jews and not have the Palestinian civilians in the way. I mean, everything throughout history everything is always used, is weaponized as an excuse to undermine diplomacy, peace, and to justify aggression. And that's Israel falling in that playbook. And as you were saying, they have the corporate media just buying into it every single time.
Yeah, here's an example of that. And this was what the whole propaganda ploy was designed to do.
You're getting at the idea that there should be a two-state solution. I was walking into the studio tonight and saw that the Empire State Building was orange in honor of the Bibas family. I think the idea of a two-state solution died with the Bibas family and the disgusting carnival-like display that was put on by Hamas and the Palestinian people when they were handing those remains back. There cannot be a two-state solution for people who celebrate the death of those little
We're
babies.
not talking. You're trying to get us off the topic.
You're getting at the idea that they're.
Forget for a second that the two-state solution is a fundamentally unjust solution, because for Palestinians, that would be just 22% of their homeland. It would mean accepting Israel, which, again, especially now, it's hard to ask any Palestinian to do. Forget that for a second. What he's saying is, and this is what Israel anthropologists have done forever, is that Palestinians, he's trying to find an excuse to say Palestinians don't have the right to self-determination. And this is not the first time that someone has said a similar thing. After October 7th, a similar thing. How can we have a Palestinian land when they do stuff like this? And so every new weaponized case of atrocity propaganda is just used to deny Palestinians the right to self-determination, because that's what ultimately the entire Israeli project is about, is denying that. So any excuse possible will just be used to say we can't have Palestinian self-determination because ultimately we're more committed to Jewish Israeli supremacy. And
who cares about all the Palestinian children who were murdered? Who cares about the fact that hundreds of them were prisoners and were tortured, along with Palestinian women held without charges? I mean, when do you see scenes like this in Western media? This is today. These are children who were let out. Many women were returned, and children. Well, many women were kidnapped from Gaza and were taken to Israeli dungeons, and they were let out thanks to Hamas.
What we're showing there on screen, this is someone who was kidnapped as a child. He was literally kidnapped by Israel as a child, and now he's getting out with gray hair. He's been held for 33 years, literally kidnapped, imprisoned by Israel in his teens, and now he comes out with gray hair.
Here's a woman who was kidnapped from Gaza, and what she describes contains echoes of the Holocaust. They started threatening me with my children. They dragged me to Ascalon by my hair, the prison. He told me, who should I shoot first? Referring to her children, Yazan, Jannah, or Mohammed. He threatened me with my children. The entire interrogation was threats to my children. My husband went out to see what was going on. They shot him and directly put him on a helicopter. I got out to see what was going on while I was carrying my son, who's 3 years old. He took him from my arms and told me to shut up. He grabbed me by the hair and dragged me across the ground, saying, "Call out for your husband." And there were bombings above us. And he pointed a weapon at my 3 children. He asked, which child should I shoot first? While interrogating her. Who knows the names of these prisoners coming out, these literal hostages who were abused in Israeli dungeons? Who knows their names? And a lot of them are medical workers too. The Guardian finally acknowledged tons of doctors and medical workers were kidnapped and taken to torture centers in Israel. There's no building that's going to light up here for them. They're just statistics, along with the 18,000 children who were killed. But Kfir Bibas, he looks like a son. He's not American, by the way, but he looks like maybe a white son that some CNN GOP contributor might have had.
Well, that's the thing. There's been this obsession about their red hair. There's so much talk
they talk about that so often.
Constantly, which is creepy. To begin with, and also it speaks to, I mean, what's going on is that they're trying to appeal to people's bigotry and their biases that, because these kids have red hair, which conjures like a white person, then they have more value than the thousands of Palestinian kids with brown hair. Even though, by the way, actually you have some Palestinian kids in Gaza who have blonde hair. Anyway, it doesn't matter. The point is, it's an attempt at just appealing to racism, and it's gross. It's gross. It's creepy to watch.
It's revealing. Well, JD Vance made an interesting statement that I think applies here. Of course, he'll never apply it here. During my Senate campaign in 2022, I met a Ukrainian American man in Northeast Ohio. He was very angry about my views on the conflict and my desire to bring it to a rapid close. "You are trying to abandon my country and I don't like it." "Sir," I replied, "your country is the USA and so is mine." And then Vance says that he always found it offensive that a new immigrant to our country would be willing to use the power and influence of their new nation to settle the ethnic rivalries of the old. "One of the most important parts of assimilation is seeing your country as the USA." And on and on. You get his point. This could definitely be applied to the Gusano industrial complex in Miami and South Florida that controls U.S. policy on Latin America or heavily influences it in order to settle the rivalries and scores from their former countries, to topple the socialist former governments of the countries that their countries came from, their parents and grandparents came from. But it could also be said about AIPAC, couldn't it? I mean, it's a little bit more complex there, but this could easily be applied to AIPAC and the Zionist movement in general.
Yeah, I mean, ethnic rivalries, in the case of Israel, that means ethno-supremacy. Israel is an ethno-supremacist state. Jews have more rights and actually claim a divine right to all the land over the people who have lived there for far longer. And they use the U.S. to advance their agenda. I mean, that's what AIPAC is for, and that's why Miriam Adelson gives Trump over $100 million. So J.D. Vance, his administration is serving the so-called ethnic rivalries of some of its top donors. And I would love it if he could apply that observation to his top donors rather than just that random Ukrainian American guy that he met on the campaign trail.
You know, everyone talks about their racist uncle that they don't want to debate on Thanksgiving, or like, you know, people from the more progressive liberal side who don't like racism or well-meaning. They always complain about the racist uncle. It's like a meme, the racist uncle on Thanksgiving. And in Jewish families, you have like the Islamophobic or Likudnik uncle meme. It's just, although I don't necessarily have like the uncle, but there've been like characters who've shown up, and you know, you think about it, and you know, I started to think about it, like they don't actually know any Palestinians. They don't have some Muslims living in their neighborhood who are doing horrible things to them. They don't encounter Muslims, Arabs, Palestinians at all, except through the prism of the Zionism that they were raised on and indoctrinated in. And it really speaks to the cancer of Zionism within American Judaism, that there's a sector of Jews who hate people because of an ethnic rivalry thousands of miles away, and who will accuse you of anti-Semitism if you question them about being loyal to another country, or call them an Israel firster. And so many of them clearly are. So many of the Jews around Trump are Israel firsters. They're not even like, I love Israel and America equally. They're like David Friedman. They're spending their time in settlements in the West Bank. And JD Vance, I'm sure he knows it's true. I'm sure he sees the connection. But, if Peter Thiel paid for your Senate campaign and you're vice president, you're going to have to you're going to have some contradictions there. I would love to be able to ask him in public about it and see what he would say, because it just wouldn't make sense. It wouldn't ring true.
Yeah, I mean, look at even Rand Paul, who's known as an isolationist, libertarian, often, votes against the bipartisan foreign policy consensus. From what I've seen, says nothing about Israel. The only one in Congress who actually takes that sort of libertarian approach to foreign policy seriously is Thomas Massey, consistently. Like, you don't see him voting for all these Israel funding bills and pledging his fidelity to Israel. In fact, he's pointed out that like every member in Congress, basically, or most members of Congress, have an AIPAC handler, and he doesn't. He's a rare example.
Yeah. I mean, imagine if aliens came to the United States and like they're trying to understand how our system works. And then they hear everyone talking about the deep state, and they see that Elon Musk is not, I don't even know if he's an American citizen, but he's kind of controlling government on some level.
Yeah.
He has citizenship.
Yeah.
He's an immigrant. He's from South Africa, but he's basically the de facto vice president or second president by dint of his wealth. No one elected him. And it's just, so it's kind of complex. It's like, who's really who are the leaders? How do you recognize the leaders if you're an alien, like who are elected? And I think the easiest way for aliens to recognize the leaders is that before they are allowed to be elected, have to go thousands of miles away and stand inches from a wall with a little hat on and put a note in the wall that no one reads. And that's how you recognize them. And that is insane. We live in an insane society, or our leadership is insane. That's what they have to do. It's always like, oh, he did that. He's running. Now we know he's running for president. He's serious. He put a note in an old wall thousands of miles away.
That's so true. It's so true. That's a long trip just to be able to be a viable candidate.
Those are like, those things in the wall. It's like pieces of paper for people who want to be leaders. No, yeah. I mean, I did it once, and I'm like, oh, I'm gonna.
As a kid, yeah, I did. Yeah, I did it as a kid.
When I was like really spending time there, working on my book Goliath, I'd just hang out there and walk around. I'd go like have some beers in the old city and walk around, and then I'd start talking to people and just seeing who they were, where they're from. And most of the ones I met were like evangelical Christian fanatics. They weren't even Jewish. And, just for kicks, I'd like get them to speak in tongues. It's a weird place. It's not in America though. It's not in the US. You don't have to like go to like a Civil War monument or something. Like he went to Gettysburg. He's running. No.
Yeah.
He went there. What a country. Only in America. Remember that guy Yakov Smirnov?
Yes.
We should have like an American Yakov Smirnov who goes to Russia. in like Jeff Foxworthy accent. Like, in America, Yakov Smirnov would be like, in Russia, we use vodka for windshield wiper fluid. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah, and because he was willing to make those jokes, he was huge. I mean, he was everywhere. He was like one of the biggest comedians there was.
Yep.
Simply because he, was able because he made fun of the Soviet Union. Should we move on to Trump's video, his AI video about Gaza?
You might be an American. It's like Jeff Foxworthy. Yeah, more commentary on the decadent, satanic state of our leadership. Donald Trump has released or promoted an AI video, which seems to, it sort of fantasizes or dramatizes the day after in Gaza, when Gaza is finally transformed into a golden Dubai-like Riviera in which will be showered by the wealth of Elon Musk, and Donald Trump will dance with harlots, and trans belly dancers will perform on the ashes of a site of a Holocaust. And with no further ado, here's the video.
Tunnels coming to set you free, bringing the light for all to see. No more tunnels, no more fear. Trump Gaza is finally here. Trump Gaza shining bright, golden future, a brand new life. Feast and dance, the deal is done. Trump Gaza #1. Trump Gaza shining bright, golden future, a brand new life. Feast and dance, the deal is done. Trump Gaza #1.
Yeah. Let's just this is the header image though. This is idolatry. It's like the golden calf for like Trump cultists and Zionists. The golden Trump in the middle of Gaza City. It kind of looks like one of the rotundas in Gaza City.
Imagine being in Gaza and seeing that. I mean, you've lived through a Holocaust funded and armed by the US, and then you see what's now coming out of the leader of the US. And I mean, if you were to watch that, and especially if you've never been outside of Gaza and you've been trapped there your whole life because of Israel's siege, like you must think the US is the craziest country ever. I mean, and how can you not come to that conclusion if this is what the president is putting out? It's just so it shows also though that I think Trump just likes being a troll, and I don't think he's serious about his annexation plans for Gaza. I never took that call seriously. I just took that his call for U.S. owning Gaza as just him reiterating the Israeli consensus that Palestinians will never have the right to self-determination. That was his own way. That was his crude way of basically announcing that was going to be his policy too. And I think he delights in just trolling people and offending people, even people who've lived through a Holocaust.
Yeah, that's definitely the case. I don't think there's any workable plan to simply ethnically cleanse over 2 million people in Gaza, though they'll try to make their lives miserable enough to force them to leave. Egypt and Jordan are not likely to just allow them in. And Trump is going to be bogged down in so many other scandals soon. And the Ukraine initiative is obviously taking precedence. And that is, we'll talk about it later. That's an area where Trump can actually end a conflict. So you might be right. He's just trolling here. But at the same time, he's normalizing a solution to a crisis that Israel has always been seeking to mainstream, which is ethnic cleansing. Nakba 2.0, as on October 8th, 2023, Likud parliamentarian Ariel Kalner called for. They just want mass ethnic cleansing because they don't see any way solving it. And the other issue here is the vision for Gaza that Trump is putting forward has been put forward in a more serious fashion, at least through blueprints by characters who are taken more seriously within the Davos globalist realm. For example, John Kerry. I wrote about how John Kerry and Tony Blair tapped McKinsey Consulting to put forward a plan for Gaza to basically be turned into kind of a series of sweatshops for manufacturers and companies in the Gulf, like basically providing cheap labor to Dubai. And even before that, Thomas Friedman in 2005, I mean, Thomas Friedman is like the voice of Davos and one of the most elite members of the Democratic Party's commentariat, put forward the idea that Gaza could actually, following Ariel Sharon's quote unquote disengagement, which was actually just setting the stage for the siege of Gaza, be transformed into Dubai. I mean, this is what he wrote in a 2005 column. The issue for the Palestinians is no longer about how they resist the Israeli occupation in Gaza, but whether they build a decent mini state there, a Dubai on the Mediterranean. And so what he's saying there is there's no occupation anymore. And Palestinians shouldn't even care about it or resisting it. It really reads as uninformed and delusional after October 7th. But if they fail to produce a Dubai, if they fail to allow a Trump Tower to be erected in the heart of the Jabalia refugee camp, well, then they deserve siege. They deserve occupation. They're not fit for the modern world. And that is the sort of bipartisan racism and exterminationism that I think set the stage for Donald Trump to release this video so casually and to normalize the final solution for Gaza with his trademark tacky, sleazy, cretinous touch where everything's gold. And, if they can normalize that, then why can't people from the other side normalize a solution which is much more likely to lead to peace, in which Jewish, Israeli, Zionist settlers return to their countries of origin and are freed from the militaristic death cult in which they've been indoctrinated, and stop attacking their neighbors continuously and stop occupying people? Why doesn't Germany take accountability for what it did during the Holocaust and stop forcing the problem onto the back of indigenous Palestinians far away? Why don't they take responsibility? Why doesn't Poland take responsibility? Why don't the French, who collaborated with the Nazis, and the Ukrainians who collaborated, and the Romanians who collaborated, why don't they take responsibility? If they're going to normalize ethnic cleansing, then why can't the reabsorption of the settler population, the settler colonial population, be normalized? And so, I started thinking about this today, Aaron, and then I started working with some AI programs, and I started trying to make like a response video to Trump. And I literally spent like 15 minutes doing it, started trying to make the song. The song they made in that video is kind of catchy in a silly way. And working with, and then I collaborated with a friend, and we kind of came up with this EDM anthem, but we don't have the video yet. But if you want to play the anthem, this was like this is the beginning of a response to the Trump video, which clearly took like a lot of processing power to make. Like 3 seconds of that video probably took 20 minutes to process. But here's the audio.
Now, you wanted this to be EDM, but the AI gave you something different, right?
Yeah, it's more like an anthemic electro anthem. We couldn't. I wanted like a Jersey club vibe. I also have like a folk, kind of like a pop folk version, but it's not as good. So this is the best version that came out, that AI spit out. But I wrote these lyrics in like 2 minutes, and we put this together in like 15.
All right. We have a Grayzone live stream.
It's called Rising Currents.
Rising Currents, live here on the Grayzone. Let's take a listen.
Resistance axis making it rain. Settlers going back to Ukraine. Netanyahu going insane. Palestinians are home to stay. The flood is coming, the deal is done. There's no future for Bibas' sons. They're on the run, they're on the run. They know the time has come. Zionism, an evil vision. Zionism on the run. The deal is done, they're on the run. You know the time has come.
You can do the Trump dance for this part. There's more if you want it.
Rising currents shifting the fate.
Time to
If
drop
the world
Molly.
unites against the hate, it will not ever be the same. Palestine will rise again. The wave is rising, the time has come. There's no future for Bibas' sons. They're on the run, they're on the run. They know the time has come. Zionism, an evil vision. Zionism on the run. The deal is done, they're on the run. You know the time has come.
There we go.
All right. Well, that was Rising Currents, Grayzone premiere response to Trump, and AI. It's dangerous.
So you wrote the lyrics to that and you plugged it into AI, and that's what it gave you. It's
Yeah. Well, I plugged it into AI, and some other versions came out, and then I asked a friend to plug it into a different AI program, and we got to that one. I have some folk versions. One sounds like a collaboration between Jason Mraz and Bert Jansch. Another one is kind of like folk pop, but this one, is the most anthemic and closest to my original version of kind of like a EDM earworm.
Yeah, well, that part with the loud synths, the EDM, that sounded like that could have been played anytime at my gym. The really annoying music that is played there. So the AI did a good job with that one, for sure.
I can see like some, Qassam operation videos in that, when the beat drops, I can see a video. So maybe we'll actually make it. But Zionists would be outraged to hear that. They would call it, a whole, like an anthem, an anti-Semitic anthem. They would be so outraged. Maybe they will get outraged by, us just playing it on this stream. Somewhat tongue-in-cheek, somewhat, but they delight in what Donald Trump just did, and so they should really feel what it's like for the shoe to be on the other foot.
Yeah, and they find it funny. They find it funny, this like AI mock video of a Gaza Riviera that's still going through a genocide, where people are sleeping in what remains of their homes in rubble. They can't even get proper tents and mobile homes because Israel's been blocking those, although they've relented somewhat in recent days. But still, so many people are bearing, cold temperatures, sleeping in tents and wet tents, living in conditions that those of us outside Gaza can't even imagine. And then Trump drops that video, and Israel supporters have a laugh. They think it's all funny.
Yeah.
So I hope they're offended by your song if they hear it.
Well, we got to make the video.
Yeah.
What do you think of this? By the way, it's not in our show notes, but I feel like it's worth commenting on.
And we're not going to retreat. We're not going to surrender. We're not going to quit. Fight, fight, fight. and we're not going to retreat.
I mean, can we call it a sig heil now? Like Elon he kind of got away with the excuse that he was autistic or has Asperger's. Steve Bannon doesn't have Asperger's vibes, although he seems to be a lot more intelligent than Elon Musk.
Well, did you see what Barry Weiss did? How basically she tweeted a defense of this, like Barry Weiss, who loves to scream anti-Semitism at, like, I don't know, the show of a Palestinian flag, who spent her college years trying to get Palestinian professors fired because they dare to criticize Zionism. She published an article in her outlet and quoted it favorably. These stiff arm salutes are not expressions of sincere Nazism, but of an oppositional culture that, like a rebel band that keeps wearing fatigues after victory, has failed to realize it's no longer in the opposition. So to Barry Weiss, this is just about being a contrarian, not about, proudly displaying fascist Nazi signs. And she deleted that after she was mocked for it. And but again, that's just another example of how, the Zionists who love to cry anti-Semitism at every single juncture when it's people out there supporting Palestinian rights and opposing a genocide will go out of their way to then make excuses for a sig heil or something that looks like a sig heil if that's not what Steve Bannon intended to do.
What a freak show. What a complete freak show. Steve Bannon identifies as a Christian Zionist, and ultra-Zionist Barry Weiss publishes a piece by a Palestinian white nationalist, Richard Hanania, defending...
He's Palestinian?
Yeah, I think he is. Hanania is a Palestinian name. I'm pretty
Really?
sure he is. A Palestinian Zionist, white nationalist, biological determinist, Richard Hanania, defending Bannon's it was like a meek sig heil. Like Elon was like, like you could hear him do that. It was more Hitlerian, and Steve Bannon, he like kind of slipped it in there to be subversive. He defends it as a stiff-armed salute, but all of them are Zionists. I mean, everybody sig heiling now is a Zionist. Elon Musk's a Zionist who says he's aspirationally Jewish.
Did you see what Steve Bannon said about Jews that are critical of Israel?
Yeah.
Okay, let's watch it.
That.
Where are you from? I was born in Jerusalem. Folks from USSR said that expelled in real socialism. My question is to you is this: what do you think about foreign aid to Israel? Is it a strategic partnership?
Israel is a partner of the United States, but people in Israel got to understand something. The number one enemy to the people in Israel are American Jews that do not support Israel and do not support MAGA. Okay, MAGA and the evangelical Christians and the traditional Catholics in this country have Israel's back. They have the Jews' back. The biggest single enemy to the Jewish people are not the Islamic supremacists. The biggest enemy you have is inside the wire. Progressive Jewish billionaires that are funding all this stuff. They are the number one enemy, and the people in Israel got to have to set that right, because MAGA has your back, traditional Catholics have your back, and evangelical Christians have your back. We will always have the back of Israel. But I got to tell you, you have an enemy inside the wire.
Steve, the beginning of the video, it looks like, it's 3 a.m. at a bar in Saskatchewan, and some dude is just rising up to attack you out of nowhere. Like, he has like a crazed look in his eyes. But that is something Trump has said, that the biggest enemy to Jews is progressive Jews who don't support Israel. And that's another way that Zionism has just infested American life as a cancer. And it becomes the only means, the only means for defining fealty or loyalty to the Jewish faith. And therefore, people who sig heil can declare themselves Zionist and castigate Jews regardless of their relationship with Jewish religion or the Torah, because they don't worship the Israeli flag and the Israeli military. That's what Steve Bannon's saying.
Yeah. And what I find chilling is that you have, I think, a lot of liberal Zionists, people who consider themselves to be liberal or even progressive, but who support what Israel is doing. And we'll look at that, and they will find a way to rationalize that to themselves because they're so just indoctrinated by their ethno-supremacy that they'll look at that and say, well, okay, yeah. I mean, I can see how I can see why he's so upset, because these Jews, these progressive Jews, are a threat to Israel, and they should be called out. I mean, so someone like Steve Bannon, a proud evangelical, speaking about Jews as the enemy, and even to like a Zionist, that can be taken as welcome because it's in defense of their favorite ethno state. It's a scary cult. It's a very, very bipartisan. It's a very wide coalition. Evangelicals and a lot of liberals, people who define themselves as liberal. I know a lot of them.
Yeah, so do I. It's also a way of papering over the contradiction of America First, that like we should just give massive amounts of aid to this one foreign country and never touch it because there's just something so special and unshakable about our bond with it. And we can, it's always acting in our interest somehow. Should we, I kind of neglected to include notes about Syria, but Israel has been attacking southern Syria for the last several days. I can pull something up pretty quickly.
Yeah.
I mean, Netanyahu, there was a AIPAC congressional meeting in downtown DC at the Marriott. A lot of it was sort of off the record, private. I'm working on getting some info on what actually transpired there. But Netanyahu delivered a speech. Let me see if I can find the video of it.
Well, as you're looking, here's a video of Israel bombing, as it always does. This isn't anything new. They do this regularly with total impunity, bombing around Damascus. And what they've basically done is they've declared that the new Syrian government should not deploy its forces south of Damascus. Israel's laying claim to just a huge swath of territory inside of Syria. They've already taken some positions. They did that immediately after Assad was overthrown. They took Mount Hermon. They've taken more villages. Now they're claiming even more. Basically, Netanyahu is declaring himself to be the new ruler of parts of Syria, along with the former Al-Qaeda, ISIS leader, al-Julani, who's currently the president.
Yeah. Here it is. No, it's not. I don't have it right in front of me, but Netanyahu at AIPAC basically declared that he will take Mount Hermon and that everyone should visit it. It's a great place to visit. This is the highest point in Syria. It is Syrian territory according to the UN resolution passed at the cessation of hostilities in the 73 war. It's a complete violation of international law. And Israel has been bombing rampantly in southern Syria. And what has Jolani been doing, and what have his supporters been doing to counter this? It's pretty clear that they haven't fired a single shot, not a single shot against Israel as it takes more and more Syrian territory. They might not be able to. Here's one thing they did do. They attacked Syrians. They've been attacking lots of Syrians from different sects. They attacked the Sayyida Zainab shrine in Damascus. This is a holy Shia shrine that's right in Damascus's old city. And they replaced the custodians and jailed them and replace them with their own stooges. This is what Jolani's busy doing. And it's the Syria that Netanyahu wants. Here's something else they were doing while Netanyahu was preparing to attack Syrian territory. this was on the day of Hassan Nasrallah's funeral in Beirut. These are the supporters of Mohammed Jolani, aka Ahmed al-Shara, the so-called president of Syria, who controls a minority of Syrian territory now, who was installed through a military junta controlled basically by Turkey. And they have an effigy of Hassan Nasrallah's corpse, and they're going to throw it to the crowd to rip into pieces. This is while they're not doing a single thing, lifting a finger to resist Israel. They are throwing a figure to be torn apart by the crowd who dedicated his life to resisting Israel. I mean, that should tell you everything about the quote unquote new Syria. And everyone who supported that, especially within the world of Palestine solidarity, who supported regime change in Syria, should just be totally shamed right now. A lot of them just don't want to talk about it anymore. They just want to move on. But it was obvious that this was going to be the result, and that Netanyahu and Israel would take advantage of it. And removing Syria from the resistance axis also means that the flow of arms and supplies to Hezbollah is complicated, if not cut off. That was part of the design. And the idea that the Syrian government under Assad did nothing against Israel. Well, who was attacking the surface-to-air missile systems of Syria? It was the so-called rebels sponsored by the West, Turkey, and Qatar. It was the rebels who destroyed over 50% of Syria's anti-aircraft capacity, which allowed Israel to attack by air. And in fact, in 2018, an Israeli jet was downed by the Syrian Arab army through 1970s era Soviet-made surface-to-air missile. So they were doing something. They were also hosting Hezbollah, IRGC, and Palestinian factions, and now that's all gone.
When Hezbollah defeated Israel or stopped Israel's in the 2006 summer Israeli attack on Lebanon, Syria was an integral part of that because they were providing a land bridge through which Hezbollah could get weapons. And that's why the Bush administration ramped up regime change efforts against Syria in the aftermath of that, is because the Assad government played a part in stopping Israel from destroying even more of Lebanon than it did in summer 2006. And Israel suffered a defeat ultimately because they couldn't destroy Hezbollah. And that's why, if you look, shortly after that, that's when Seymour Hersh wrote an article in the New Yorker called The Redirection, which was about how the Bush administration was accelerating its regime change efforts in Syria. And that was the main reason, is because Syria was integral to defeating Israel. And that's why it was marked for regime change. And that's why when the reality of Syria became obvious what was going on, it wasn't about what your personal opinion of the Assad government is. And it doesn't deny all the grievances people in Syria had with the Assad government. The question is, do you want to be siding with Israel and the US in destroying a sovereign country? And do foreign states have the right to flood countries they don't like that undermine their hegemony, in the case of Syria, with tens of billions of dollars worth of weapons to destroy the country, to make the state not functional? And that's what has happened in Syria. And yeah, many people who should have known better were duped into cheering that on, long after the reality, reality became impossible to deny. And for good reason, those same people don't want to talk about what's happening right now inside Syria, because they helped bring that to be. Someone like Owen Jones, for example, a British pundit, cheered on the regime change and is now outraged that Israel is attacking Syria. Okay, well, good for being outraged now, but were you outraged when Israel was attacking Syria before, bombing Syria hundreds of times, literally, which helped pave the way for the very regime change that people like him cheered on?
Yeah, I can think of a lot of other names.
Yeah.
And it feels like punching down sometimes.
Yeah.
But not with Owen Jones. Mehdi Hassan always comes up.
Yeah.
What's that guy from Drop Site? I always forget about him. I forgot his name. Anyway. Yeah. There's US troops in northeast Syria. Trump has wanted to get them out. It's going to be much harder for the U.S. occupation of northeast Syria to end with the Israelis in southwestern Syria, and with the Israelis basically tempting Syrians to attack them. If there is any conflict, they'll say the U.S. is leaving and they're leaving us exposed. They're leaving Israel's security exposed. We need this buffer zone. So Netanyahu's move is also directed, I think, at the United States to compel them to continue occupying Syria, occupying Syria's gas and oil fields, occupying Syria's breadbasket, its wheat fields. This is another effect of regime change. And Trump sort of had to deny that he planned to end the U.S. occupation, where there are thousands of troops, 2,000 troops at least, twice as many as we previously knew were there. And this is also a tripwire. It's a tripwire for Iran to start conflict with Iran, moving closer into Iran's compromising Iran's immediate strategic depth. So we've been properly bashing Trump a lot. There's one thing Trump is trying to do that I couldn't call it admirable because of the way he seems to be going about it, but he is following through with his campaign promise to end the Ukraine proxy war. At the same time, also demanding in imperialist fashion to be able to pillage Ukraine more than it was already being pillaged by the IMF, World Bank, BlackRock, and European states. Aaron, give us an update on what's happening there, because I know you're closing in on a book about the Ukraine proxy war. And so you've been following this more closely than I have.
It's still unclear what exactly Trump's policy is. And I'm not even sure he himself has figured that out. But what we can see publicly is that the Trump administration is rhetorically shifting the U.S. government line. At the UN the other day, they voted with Russia for a measure marking the 3 years of Russia's invasion and basically calling for a peace deal. And they voted against a Ukrainian-authored measure that condemned Russia for the invasion. And top Trump officials like Steve Witkoff and Pete Hegseth have gone on TV and basically said that Russia was provoked. And Steve Witkoff has even talked about having a peace deal that was based on the Istanbul Accords, which was the deal that was brokered by Ukrainians and Russians in the spring of 2022, right after Russia invaded, but which the US and UK blocked. And so even acknowledging the Istanbul Accords is an achievement in itself, because the corporate media, and actually a lot of progressive media too, has totally ignored the Istanbul Accords because it showed that Russia was willing to negotiate, which undermines the propaganda line that you can't negotiate with Russia. And they've also ignored it because the US blocked the Istanbul deal from going through. And so therefore, and so they had to ignore that blockage by the US to justify funneling tens of billions of more dollars into Ukraine proxy war. So the Trump administration talking about Russia being provoked, talking about a new peace deal based in Istanbul, that's a huge rhetorical shift. Policy-wise, though, Trump is still forcing Ukraine to sign a mineral deal, which apparently Zelensky will do at the White House on Friday, if that goes ahead, in which, as you said, the U.S. will continue to pillage Ukraine. And Trump's been a little inconsistent about what that actually means. Is he going to offer, is he going to continue giving Ukraine weapons? He actually hasn't ruled that out yet. What he has ruled out is NATO for Ukraine. And he's also ruled out giving Ukraine a security guarantee, which is what Zelensky really, really wants. And Zelensky initially said he wouldn't sign a deal without a security guarantee. Now he is signing the deal. And all this deal promises him is that the U.S. will help Ukraine towards getting a security guarantee, which means in Trump's eyes, we'll help you get one from Europe and not from us, which is a huge embarrassment for Zelensky because that's what he's basically staked his political future on. And what's funny about all this is that Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the UK, he's now in the US, and he's basically begging Trump for something. And what he wants from Trump is for Trump to back up a European-led peacekeeping force in Ukraine, and basically to promise that if that European peacekeeping force comes under attack by Russia, that Trump and the US will back them up. But Trump so far is not doing that. But to get that from Trump, Keir Starmer, in typical British lapdog fashion, is humiliating himself. So watch Keir Starmer after, initially it was pretty obvious he was against Trump's candidacy. He was critical of Trump before the election. Watch Keir Starmer today sucking up to Trump at the White House.
For a very long time now, the closest alliance, I think, of any two countries when it comes to prosperity and security. And I know that together we will strengthen that even further. And on issues like Ukraine, thank you for changing the conversation to bring about the possibility that we can have a peace deal. And we want to work with you to make sure.
So people like Keir Starmer and UK intelligence were freaking out about the possibility of Trump's election. They were involved in working against it. And certainly they were fear-mongering about what this would mean for Ukraine. And now he has to go to Trump and say, thank you for changing the conversation and making peace a possibility, which, by the way, is a tacit admission that before the prevailing policy led by Biden, which Keir Starmer was following, was against peace. So he has to suck up to Trump because now he's desperate for Trump to sign on to a peace deal and therefore has to tell him that it's Trump who is making peace possible.
Thank you for, I mean, he was advised to do that. You can't oppose as the UK, as the junior partner of US empire. What army do you have to oppose Russia with if the US completely pulls out? Trump's not going to respond very positively.
Well, Trump basically asked, on that point, Trump pointed out that the UK is toothless militarily against Russia at their meeting at the White House.
Between our two countries, that is why this is the greatest alliance for prosperity and security I think the world has ever seen. Whenever necessary, we absolutely backed each other up, and that's at the
Could you take on Russia by yourselves?
Well, all right, one or two more.
He says, "Can you take on Russia by yourself?" And he's mocking him because he knows he can't. He knows he can, and this underscores that throughout this whole, through all the talk about Europe standing up to Russia and the Ukrainian agency, this has always been about the U.S. And now that the U.S. is possibly changing its policy, Keir Starmer has to go hat in hand begging Trump to back him up. And I don't know which way Trump is going to go, but if the rhetoric is any guide, talking about making peace with Russia, talking about how the fact that this could have been avoided, Trump's repeatedly criticized Zelensky for not making a peace deal earlier. If we're going by that, then yeah, Trump is not going to give them what they need, and this will be a huge humiliation. But again, with Trump, you never know because he's erratic. He said positive things about diplomacy in his first term and then did the opposite. He's been bragging recently about how much he armed Ukraine as opposed to Obama. So you never know. But certainly to get what they want, to continue the proxy war, to continue warmongering, people like Keir Starmer have to humiliate themselves even more.
Well, Trump will have more control over the policy than he did in his first term. As Colonel Doug McGregor, who was in the Trump administration toward the end of the first term, told Andrew Coburn in his new Harper's piece about, Trump versus the deep state. There was no Trump administration. There was only a Trump era because Trump was surrounded by, hawks and figures who wanted to escalate the proxy war, including his vice president, Mike Pence, who's now basically part of the apparatus of the Never Trump opposition. But I mean, all of his chiefs of staff and John Bolton. So he has more control now. He has more authority. The U.S. public is more behind him. At least a plurality of the American public thinks we're giving too much aid to Ukraine, and a majority of Trump's base. But the freak out is really happening in the UK and in Germany. I mean, Friedrich Merz, after he's basically the next chancellor of Germany from the CDU, said that the Germany can no longer look to the US as an ally. That's kind of a disastrous move, given Germany's debt, given where its GDP is. Where's it going to turn to for exports? Is it going to turn to China? I don't think that'll do it. And then you have in the UK this concession to reality by Keir Starmer. But who's not ceding to reality. You'll love this headline. I want to get your reaction to it. Is veteran, seasoned military strategist George Monbiot. The question, this is in The Guardian, I think today. The question no one dares ask: what if Britain has to defend itself from the US?
Well, the George Monbiot's got to sign up.
The enemy is already inside the gates.
Well, listen, great. Then George Monbiot's got to sign up, enlist in the military, just like he wanted to young Ukrainians to go sacrifice themselves to fight Keir Starmer and Donald Trump and Joe Biden's proxy war. He's got to sign up now that Trump is turning on the alliance and siding with Russia, according to George Monbiot's narrative. Sign up, George.
George Monbiot would be storming the beaches of Rehoboth, Delaware, with organic guns and artisanal bullets.
Cook some great vegan meals for your fellow soldiers when you're in the trenches. It's that strain of what's called the left is just
clown.
It's just so pathetic. It's just so pathetic, and disproportionately, a huge number of these people call themselves leftists, but find themselves aligning with neocon projects. A huge disproportion come from the UK for some reason. They really have something going on there where they're really represented in the media more than any other nation, like Western nation. Just these people call themselves left, but always end up siding, or often end up siding with neocons.
Like Paul Mason.
Paul Mason. Yes.
Paul Mason is now, what is he doing now? This is a guy who was a revolutionary Trotskyist, and now he is an associate fellow at the Council on Geostrategy, which is funded by NATO and the arms industry. And he's like a geostrategic NATO lobbyist. Let's look at Paul Mason's employer. Just this was like the guy who fashioned himself as the Corbyn whisperer for the media, when he was actually, as we exposed, a national security state collaborator. The Council on Geostrategy, about our mission to generating new geostrategic thinking for a more competitive age, so that the United Kingdom can succeed and prosper, and focus on free and open nations in the Euro-Atlantic, Indo-Pacific, and polar regions. Paul Mason's helping lead the UK push into the Arctic against Russia. Ethics and what's ethics and funding? Their list of supporters: AT&T, BAE Systems, Boeing Defense, Carnival Cruise Lines, Northrop Grumman, the British Ministry of Defense, Maersk Shipping, Lockheed Martin, Foreign Office, which was where Paul Mason snitched on the left to his Foreign Office contacts, and on and on. The Taipei, Taiwan, Thales, which is an Australian defense company and surveillance company, Royal Navy Strategic Studies Center, Royal Navy, Rolls-Royce, which makes engines for the British Air Force, Raytheon. I mean, that really shows you what's acceptable within the British left, to just join a think tank like that just a few years after you infiltrated the Corbyn campaign. I'm completely getting off track from the subject here, which is Ukraine.
Yeah.
But Paul Mason, as we remember, was leading pro-Ukraine leftist marches with union members, pro-Ukraine war marches in London to counter the anti-war movement, and still is.
He still is. Here's another clip from Trump at the White House with Keir Starmer. Just recently, he's called Zelensky a dictator. And all of a sudden, now that Zelensky looks like he's signing a deal handing over Ukraine's mineral rights to the U.S., Trump looks like he's dropping that.
Did I say that? I can't believe I said that.
Can you go back to the beginning of the clip?
Them is not the best. Did I say that? I can't believe I said that. Next question.
Did I say that? So,
Did I call him a dictator?
But Trump did stick to one thing. He did stick to his insistence that Ukraine is not going to join NATO. He said that multiple times, and he reiterated that again at the White House next to Keir Starmer.
To be part of NATO as part of this deal. Are you willing to budge on that at all, or is it a firm?
Well, I could be very nice and say, oh, well, we'll work to it. Look, it's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. That's what started this whole thing. Biden said that, and all of a sudden the gun started. That was one of the primary reasons this started. And this was long before President Putin. They never said it was an impossibility. So we can say, oh, gee, well, we'll try. But that's something that's just not going to happen. And then the other question I ask is about the land. Will you get your land back? Well, they've fought long and hard on the land, and you and I will be discussing that. And we're going to certainly try and get as much as we can back. But on the NATO, it's just not, that's not going to happen. Yeah, please.
And that's why the Uniparty, pro-war establishment hates Trump, is because he'll say stuff like that sometimes. He'll actually say the truth that Russia was provoked. This started because of NATO expansion. He's actually willing to say it. And that's why they can't stand him, because you can't be the president of the U.S., the head of the war machine, and undermine with your comments some of the key propaganda points that sustain the war machine. In the case of Ukraine, you have to say things like Russia was unprovoked. They invaded to restore the Soviet Union. And Trump's saying, no, actually, it's because of NATO expansion. Of course, there are many other things. The Maidan coup, tearing up of arms control, which Trump took part in, on and on. But that is a core truth that no one else in Washington was willing to say.
And so Trump is demanding 50% of Ukraine's mineral wealth.
Yep.
What are your thoughts?
Well, I don't think this. I mean, look, it's really cynical, and it just shows how horribly Ukraine's been treated. It's been treated as a colony for so long. The fact that Trump can go in and just demand that it hand over its wealth. But the problem is, I mean, putting aside the immorality of that, I don't really know how much wealth there is to extract. The value of Ukraine's mineral wealth has been inflated by Zelensky. This was his idea. This was part of his big victory, so-called victory plan that he pitched Trump on. And like he was desperate to get Trump to give him more weapons and authorization to use those weapons even deeper into Russia. And so, yeah, he said this was his idea. This is what he came up with. But in the process, they overinflated the actual value of these minerals. They're really expensive to extract, and it's not even clear that they can be extracted. And then you have the problem of a lot of this wealth is now controlled by Russia in territory that Russia took over. So, and I think Trump knows that. I just think he wanted to be able to say that, like, Ukraine's no longer taking us for a ride and we're going to get something out of this. I think he wanted to be able to tell that to his voters. And again, he's not actually promising Ukraine anything. Ukraine wanted a security guarantee. They didn't get that. They wanted to promise a future military assistance. They didn't get that. So this is Trump, to me, just being cynical and reminding Ukraine of its role as a client and getting it to, undergo this humiliation of forking over more of its wealth. But in terms of whether that will actually happen, how much wealth will actually be extracted, I don't think there's that much for Trump to take.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think in 2024, Zelensky had some think tank in Latvia or Lithuania put together a paper claiming that Western Ukraine was rich in mineral wealth, rare earth minerals, and there's no evidence that this is true, but he was trying to entice Trump into supporting Ukraine and changing course on his plan to end the proxy war. The reality is most of the wealth is actually in the Donbass. It's hydrocarbon wealth, coal. It was discovered long ago, and international investors don't really want to move into a conflict zone. So until the conflict ends, that wealth can't really be tapped, and it will probably be in Russian hands, almost certainly, because they control the Donbass. It does help explain why Ukraine went to war for the Donbass and was bombarding its population and seeking to keep its population under its control when they voted for their own independence. But what Trump can get out of Ukraine, mineral wealth, that's also kind of PR for the American public and his base. It's like when he complained that the US, the Bush administration, failed to take the gas and oil from Iraq. The gas prices didn't go down. So what was the point? He said that the US should take Syria's oil. He said the US should take Venezuela's oil. It's always like, why are we going to go to war or do any or attack these countries unless we can get something out of it? And it's consistent with all of his rhetoric about the Panama Canal and Greenland. Something has to be gotten for the US. It's kind of, turn of the century, McKinley era imperialism. And at the same time, I mean, Ukraine owes a lot, and I don't know how they're going to pay it back without being pillaged. This is one of the few times I've found Counterpunch useful in the last, I guess, since Alexander Coburn died. This is by Eric Toussaint. Ukraine's internal and external public debt has increased by 60% since the war began. It's like $100 billion US dollars. It was already $100 billion US dollars before the invasion. By the end of 2024, it was $160 billion. Its debt to the EU multiplied by more than 8 times. Its debt to the World Bank has more than tripled. Its debt to the IMF in this same period went from 14 to 17.6 billion. And the IMF practices abusive interest rates of up to 8%. It also owes to finance markets in the form of sovereign bonds acquired by investment funds such as BlackRock. And its external public debt comes to about $115 billion. So how will it pay it back? It's probably just going to have to be either pillaged or forgiven. And, as its public assets are sold off, more and more of its population is just going to go abroad, fuel the migration crisis.
Just a side note about Counterpunch. The last time I remember Counterpunch being useful was when they published really good reporting by the veteran British journalist Jonathan Steele, formerly of The Guardian, about the OPCW scandal. It was one of the early reports about the whistleblowers who exposed the cover-up of their chemical weapons investigation in Syria. They published that and then proceeded to attack me for also covering the OPCW leaks. So that's Counterpunch. I don't know what happened there, but Alexander Coburn is the late great Alexander Coburn is deeply missed.
Yeah. As will be the nation state of Ukraine, thanks to this war, which its post-Maidan leadership provoked. I think, I don't know. Do you want to do Venezuela real fast?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Let's do that and then get out of here quickly.
All right.
It's on a related note, I think.
Donald Trump Jr. got some exciting news the other day as he was interviewing a top Venezuelan opposition figure. What's her name? Maria Corina
Machado, who's the de facto leader of the opposition. Exciting news for regime change fanatics.
Really, really exciting. Here he is announcing it.
Got to work on your bandwidth.
On a license, and it says, and I quote, "We are hereby reversing the consent."
Is the video playing all right or no?
Restart it.
Okay.
Well, we actually have my father's official statement on the revocation of the Chevron license, and it says, and I quote, "We are hereby reversing the concessions that crooked Joe Biden gave to Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela on the oil transaction agreement dated November 26, 2022. So this kills the Chevron license, correct? I mean, you think this is the opportunity that perhaps you need to get him to the table to make sure people understand that America actually means business, and that let's say those concessions are no longer going to allow them just to continue this nonsense.
This is a huge step, and this sends a clear, firm message that Maduro is in huge trouble.
All right. So Donald Trump Jr. is really excited that his dad is going to no longer allow Chevron to pump oil in Venezuela, which of course will hurt the Venezuelan economy even more. And I thought these guys were supposed to be America first. I thought they were supposed to be giving up regime change, when the whole point of blocking companies like Chevron is to pursue regime change. It was a part of Trump's effort that he launched in his first term, largely at the behest of John Bolton and Mike Pompeo, to overthrow Maduro. And I thought that they were putting an end to all that, to put America first and to lower energy prices, because by cutting off Venezuela, what you're effectively doing on top of crushing Venezuela's economy and creating migrants, you're also raising energy prices for everyday Americans.
Yeah, the Trump administration had Richard Grenell in Caracas to negotiate, first of all, the release of several Americans who had been imprisoned there, accused of crimes, financial crimes, and spying, and also to negotiate the return of Venezuelan migrants, which the Venezuelan government of Nicolas Maduro is happy to accept. And many of those migrants are happy to return home, provided that there's some economy to return to. It's not like they're, coming to the U.S. to because they hate Venezuela and they want to get our wonderful healthcare benefits, our free healthcare benefits, and go to like Keith Urban concerts in Branson, Missouri. They're just here because they're economic refugees, and because there was TPS, which was a disastrous policy of the Biden administration, supported by Marco Rubio, the new Secretary of State. He helped shepherd it through, and part of it was about in growing the Gusano industrial complex of the Miami Cuban and Venezuelan, Nicaraguan kind of anti-communist regime change lobby by bringing more of them in. It was also about Donald Trump being able to generate more fear and xenophobia during his election campaign. The Republican Congress refused to pass the bill that the Democrats put forward, a very draconian border bill, because they wanted the crisis to fester under Joe Biden. And as the crisis built, both parties colluded to destroy Venezuela's economy, but Biden allowed the waiver on Chevron, so Chevron could continue to operate, partly because gas prices were so high in the U.S. Venezuela provides heavy crude, and it gets mixed in Texas. And they were sanctioning Russian oil at the time. So you have the opportunity now for the Trump administration, and I thought this was going to be the deal after Richard Grenell visited Caracas, the opportunity for Venezuela to absorb many of the migrants who, I've seen them, I'm sure you've seen them, Aaron, were languishing in horrid conditions in New York. And many of them were just like lining up around the block to stay in hotels. The New York taxpayers were paying for it. Hotels were completely, too. Chicago, just a bad situation all around. They could go back and have an economy, and the U.S. would also get cheaper oil. But the Gusano industrial complex has to imposed its will on Trump with its figurehead, Maria Corina Machado, whose entire career was sponsored by what? USAID. She is a creation of USAID. Imposed on Donald Trump this demented, contradictory policy of giving up TPS and at the same time just continuing to destroy Venezuela's economy, which, as the economist Francisco Rodriguez has pointed out, will fuel, and as you pointed out, Aaron, will fuel more mass migration to the north, to the U.S.-Mexico border through the Darien Gap from Venezuela.
Well, here he is. The evidence is clear. U.S. sanctions deepened Venezuela's economic contraction and drove millions to leave. Revoking oil licenses will worsen the crisis and force more to flee. More sanctions won't bring political change. They will only bring more suffering to Venezuelan families. And this is an opposition economist, someone who Anya Parmpil interviewed extensively for her book, Corporate Coup, someone who's not a big fan of Maduro, but who nonetheless has the honesty to recognize that the sanctions imposed in the name of, undermining Maduro will actually just destroy Venezuela's economy. And someone else who pointed this out is the architect of Trump's regime change policy in Venezuela, along with Mike Pompeo, John Bolton, who said this to the Washington Post last year. There was no doubt the sanctions, along with the general economic deterioration before we imposed them. All right, so he's downplayed. But anyway, there's no doubt the sanctions was driving a lot of people out of the country. That, to me, was a way to put pressure on the country. So John Bolton admitted, and he tries to say that this was happening anyway, but if you look at the charts that Francisco Rodriguez put together, you see the major contraction of Venezuela's economy comes right when the worst Trump sanctions on Venezuela hit. So he's acknowledging, John Bolton is, that his way of putting pressure on the country, which is murderous sanctions, drove migration. And of course, and then Trump goes, and as you talked about, then demonizes this very same migrants that he helps cause through his policies. And it's just another example where commitment to hegemony, commitment to overthrowing anyone who's outside of U.S. control supersedes everything else, including Trump's professed concern with stopping migration and lowering energy prices. His policies undermined both of those areas in terms of stopping migration and lowering energy prices. Trump's coup in Venezuela, his coup attempt, undermined him there.
I think that, well, with Rubio's been kind of given this this is Rubio's mission as Secretary of State, and he's been allowed to carry it out by Trump, provided he supports the policy on Ukraine and everything else, and acknowledges that we're in a multipolar world, as he did, which was really surprising. And Trump, I think his inner circle has been convinced that Venezuela can actually be brought to its knees economically, and that regime change is within reach there. There's also something I've pointed out before. Remember when Elon Musk was going bonkers for Venezuela, suddenly just was obsessed with it when Maria Corina Machado was protesting the election results. And what does Elon Musk need to fuel his business empire other than massive amounts of corporate welfare from the Pentagon and other government bodies? He needs electric batteries, and to produce electric batteries, you need minerals. And Venezuela, unlike Western Ukraine, has lots and lots of it, lots of lithium. And so we will coup whoever we want, as Elon Musk said about Bolivia. It looks to me like Maria Corina Machado promised Elon Musk and a business consortium close to Donald Trump easy access to Venezuela's mineral wealth if they financed her campaign and brought her back to power. So I think that could be an issue here. And it's absolutely clear, because they're saying this on the record. The person they put in charge in the NSC of Cuba policy, Mauricio Claron, who's operating, I think he might be in the State Department. He's in charge of Cuba. He's a Miami Cuban regime changer, has said that he believes that there will be regime change in Cuba in the near future. It's just a question of how. And the Trump administration has just reimposed sanctions on Cuba in the form of making it a state sponsor of terrorism again. The Biden administration removed that designation in the final hours of Biden's presidency. And that
the final hours.
Yeah. I mean, it was a completely cowardly move, and they knew Trump would reimpose it. But when you do that to a country, especially a country that's 90 miles from the United States, it's impossible for it to have an economy. And conditions are dire inside Cuba right now.
And all this comes, Trump, intensifying the sanctions on Venezuela, intensifying sanctions on Cuba. All this comes just as Rick Grenell, who you mentioned earlier, he's the Trump envoy who helped secure the release of American citizens in Venezuela and traveled there for that. This comes a few days after at CPAC, the CPAC conference this past weekend. He said the U.S. is no longer in the business of regime change.
But I want to say one thing that's really important in this conversation. Donald Trump has done something different than Republican foreign policy leaders have done for 25 years.
This is a paradigm shift, what he's doing.
We articulate very clearly under Donald Trump, we don't do regime change. We are going to deal with the countries that are in front of us. And our criteria is not how do we make that country better, how do we make America better, stronger, and more prosperous for the people that live here?
So if you don't do regime change, why are you still pursuing regime change policies like imposing murderous sanctions on Venezuela, which were undertaken, as John Bolton talked about, in the name of regime change? That was the whole point, was to change the government. So if you're really not in the business of regime change anymore, as Rickenell claims, then they have to rethink these policies.
If to the extent there's any thinking at all. I mean, Grinnell is more of a Trump guy than Rubio. He's probably going to be the next Secretary of State if Rubio doesn't last. And his main focus is China. He's an anti-China hardliner. And as long as the U.S. is sanctioning countries in Latin America, China will be offsetting the impact of U.S. sanctions by providing economic incentives and infrastructure to these countries. I saw it in Nicaragua. I hadn't been down there for like a year, and just being around anywhere, any city in Nicaragua, but especially in Managua, the Chinese presence was more visible than ever. They're providing affordable goods, and even Chinese restaurants are just everywhere, but affordable goods and imports due to the impact of the NICA Act passed by Congress unanimously. Like, no one voted against it, to sanction Nicaragua because it has a socialist oriented government that resisted a US-backed coup. China is also working to provide infrastructure. They're putting forward plans for a new airport, even possibly building a canal, which the US would fervently oppose. But this is because the US won't play ball with these countries. So the only way that they can survive is to pivot to China. So, I mean, the US has to make a choice. Does it continue to accelerate the dawn of a multipolar world through its regime change and sanctions policy, or does it do diplomacy? And right now it's choosing the former, as we should have expected under a Rubio State Department.
Yeah. It wasn't hard to predict.
No. Anyway, great show, Aaron. Thanks a lot, as always. Thanks to everyone for joining us. I'm glad you liked our AI generated music. Shout out to George, who collaborated with me on Rising Currents, our Trump response track. And maybe we'll make a video. It's definitely, I mean, I think it's better than Macklemore as a Gaza anthem.
Why do you got to diss Macklemore? I appreciate what Macklemore has done, and I like his songs. I thought he put out some good tracks, but I guess we'll disagree on that one. You're not a fan, obviously.
I don't know. It's like, I'm not going to say anything.
Okay.
It's hard for me to get over like the old Macklemore, but anyway, it was AI generated. He's a real person, so he did organic artisanal music, something that will be increasingly rare in the future as robots take over everything. Hopefully we'll still have humans working at the Grayzone. Subscribe. We're just so suppressed on YouTube. So subscribe, like this stream.
Find the Grayzone on Substack. Grayzone recently joined there. Max, you're writing regular commentaries now, which is great to see. You had a really funny one about Elon Musk and his sperm army, which I thought was pretty funny. And
he's just giving out sperm. He's like, oh,
yeah. So make sure to follow the Grayzone on Substack as well.
Yeah, our Substack site is great, and it's got a lot of video content there as well. And we'll be back next week with a lot more analysis. I want to do something on Taiwan, by the way. That's heating up. Trump has just announced that he refused to answer whether he would defend Taiwan against an invasion, but that's heating up. So we'll try to cover that next time. And thanks again for joining us, Aaron. I don't know if there's anything you want to add or.
No, thanks everyone for watching, and please like the stream and share it.
But you're closing in on a book.
I'm closing in on a book. Yes, I'm closing in on a book, and I'll have more to announce soon.
Well, it's published by Or Books, and so once you actually deliver a draft, they get it out pretty quickly. So I think we'll be seeing an Aaron Mate book soon.
I think so too.
I'm calling it this time.
Yeah.
I can feel it. All right. Peace, everybody.
Peace.